Good evening, friends. It's May 22nd, 2022. We've had a gorgeous Lord's Day here in Calgary, Alberta. I hope it is wherever you are today as well. Thankful for our church family that have joined us tonight, friends from the Calgary area, and perhaps others who have just stumbled across us on the internet tonight. We're thankful that you're here with us because we want to look at a really important question tonight. We're going to be looking at climate change in the Bible. Climate change in the Bible. So welcome to the Calgary Bible Institute. I'm Dr. Michael Miller, one of the pastors at Foundation Baptist Church. On behalf of our church family, we welcome you tonight. We're going to pray together, and then we will get straight to the topic at hand, climate change and the Bible. Lord, thank you so much for the beauty of your word, the practicality of your word, your wisdom that comes through in every page. Pray that you'd help those tonight that are scared about climate change and unsure what to do, that you would give them hope through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And for those that know you, that they would be able to take this material and have rest in their souls, and then also be able to use some of this material in helping their friends that are struggling with fear about climate change. We pray for Jesus' sake. Amen. So let's get right to the million-dollar question. Who or what is to blame for the natural disasters that we see around us, such as hurricanes or typhoons or heat or drought or cold or floods or tornadoes? Is it man-made climate change? Is it a creationist like myself who's skeptical of the prevailing theory about climate change? Is God responsible for natural disasters? Is it Adam who's responsible for natural disasters? These are good questions. The popular view today, though it's certainly not a consensus, but the popular view today is that climate change is caused by mankind. After Hurricane Harvey a few years back, Mark Herksgaard of The Nation said this. He said, "The victims of Hurricane Harvey have a murderer, and it's not the storm." He went on then to blame global warming for Harvey's severity, and he castigated anyone who was unsure or unwilling to take drastic measures to combat climate change. Herksgaard, writing for The Nation, said, "Murder is murder, whether the murderers admit it or not." Strong language for sure. Another journalist wrote, "Climate change denial should be a crime. You should be punished if you deny climate change." And even Pope Francis claimed the hurricanes proved that the effects of climate change, and warned, if we do not turn back, we will go down. So doomsday language from Pope Francis, but he's certainly not alone in that sentiment. So that leads us to the next question. Does the Bible answer the question of who or what is to blame for natural disasters? Well, Romans 8 tells us that creation is groaning under the curse. When Adam and Eve sinned, Genesis 3, God put the earth under a curse, and the earth is groaning under that, and part of that are these natural disasters. So ultimately, who is to blame for natural disasters? It's not God, because he's not the source of evil. It's our first parents. It's Adam. As our representative of humanity, he chose wrong, and the world was plunged into what we see now. It's a beautiful world, but it's a dangerous world for sure. So Adam ultimately is responsible for natural disasters, but I also want you to think about a second aspect, is that God is in control of natural disasters because he controls the weather. And this was even reflected in the past on waiver forms or insurance forms. A waiver form if you're ready to go skiing and you have to sign your life away that you're not going to sue the ski resort if you run into a tree and hurt yourself. But on these waiver forms or insurance forms, they talk about acts of God. God is in control of natural disasters. He sends them just as he rules all nature. I want to ask you to turn to Psalm 104, please. Psalm 104. If you have the notes for the Calgary Bible Institute, if you're on our mailing list, then I put this in your notes. But for those of you that don't, Psalm 104 is a beautiful passage about God's control over nature. Verse 14, the songwriter, the unnamed songwriter, tells us, He, God, causes the grass to grow for the cattle and vegetation for the labor of man, so that he may bring forth food from the earth, and wine which makes man's heart glad, so that he may make his face glisten with oil, food which sustains man's heart. The trees of the Lord drink their fill, the cedars of Lebanon which he planted, where the birds build their nests, and the stork, whose home is the fir trees. Pause right there. My mother-in-law has a robin that's built a nest in one of the bushes in her front yard and has laid beautiful turquoise eggs, the most beautiful color you can imagine. The high mountains, verse 18, are for the wild goats. These are ibex. You can see these in Israel today, particularly around the Dead Sea area. The cliffs are a refuge for the Shephanim. He made the moon for the seasons. The sun knows the place of its setting. You, God, appoint darkness, and it becomes night, in which all the beasts of the forest prowl about. The young lions roar after their prey and seek their food from God. When the sun rises, they withdraw and lie down in their dens. Man goes forth to his work and to his labor until evening. And then the songwriter gives us a summary here in verse 24 of God's amazing creation and control over nature. And he says, "O Lord, how many are your works?" There's a lot of them. "In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your possessions, your creatures." All the animals, all nature belongs to God and is under his care. God rules over all nature. Psalm 147 verses 16 to 18 tells us that God gives snow like wool. He scatters the frost like ashes. He casts forth his ice as fragments. Who can stand before his cold? We still get snow here in Alberta in May and sometimes even into June. It's from the Lord. He sends forth his word and melts them. He causes his wind to blow and the waters to flow. God is in control of the weather. In Job 38, God tells Job that not only is he in charge of the weather, he's also in charge of the natural disasters, that part of the weather. So the predominant view today is not that God's in control, but it's Mother Nature, and perhaps she's angry at us for misusing her. Al Gore, former Vice President of the United States, published a documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, and he won a Nobel Prize in 2007, and this, among other things, really popularized the climate change alarmism, though back then it was more emphasis on global warming, and it's shifted more to climate change today. And you can find an article in the newspaper or online about every time you get on something having to do with environmentalism or climate change or the impending disaster facing our universe. Even on vending machines. I remember one time we were staying at a hotel in Edmonton for a conference, and the Coke machine had a sticker that said something like, "This machine reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 99.9% compared to other pop machines." So you don't even get a pop nowadays without having to think about climate change. And it's not just evolutionists that are calling for radical steps to avert impending climate disaster. Many professing believers are promoting it as well. For instance, the Evangelical Climate Initiative from a few years ago was signed by 300 church leaders Some big names like Dr. Dwayne Litfin, who was a former president at Wheaton College there in Chicago. Rob Bell, who used to pastor in Michigan, maybe still is, I'm not aware. Rick Warren from Saddleback Community Church in California, one of the biggest churches in America. And this initiative makes some very broad statements. Notice what this Evangelical Climate Initiative says. The same love for God and neighbor that compels us to preach salvation through Jesus Christ, to protect the unborn, to preserve the family and the sanctity of marriage, and to take the whole gospel to a hurting world, also compels us to recognize that human-induced climate change is a serious Christian issue requiring action now. So notice they're putting it apparently on the level, and I'm not trying to put words in their mouths, but the way they phrase it, they put it on the level of preaching the gospel. So just like we got to preach the gospel, we also have to do something about human-induced climate change. So they encourage you to reduce global warming pollution to zero by looking at their cooling creation resource page. And they say, working together and with God's help, we can make a difference. I'm not mocking these folks. I'm simply pointing out that it's not just evolutionists who are saying that climate change is human-induced and requires immediate, radical, drastic action. It's professing believers. And I'm not saying that everyone who signed this is certainly a believer. For instance, Rob Bell has evidences of being a false teacher. But those who claim to be evangelicals are saying the same thing that Darwinian naturalists are. But I want you to ask yourself, before we take radical steps that will potentially do great damage to the economies of third world nations and potentially make it nearly impossible for people living on the brink of starvation to be able to put food on their table, before we take these radical steps in our first world countries, I want us to back up and to ask some big picture questions. And some of you have thought through some of these questions before. Others of you, this is the first time you've ever considered them. So, a simple question: has the world warmed? The short answer to that question is that yes, it has. About 0.7 degrees Celsius, about 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1880. So about last 140 years, about 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit. I want you to think through this, friends. If the world is slightly warmer, is that a bad thing for most people on Earth? Perhaps, perhaps not. But doesn't cold weather kill more people than hot weather? Think about CO2. Is it altogether harmful? Does it help plants to grow? And that leads us to a second question. Is man responsible for the slightly warmer temperatures in our world since 1880? Are there potentially other explanations that might be more viable, more compelling? Could it be that volcanoes are leading to an increase in CO2? Could it be sunspots, the increased sunspot activity? Could it be water vapor? One scientist, Dr. Jason Lau, writes, contrary to popular belief, water vapor is far more significant to the greenhouse effect than CO2. Some have estimated that water vapor is responsible for as much as 95% of greenhouse warming. Could another natural phenomena like ocean and air currents, such as El Nino, explain? I'm asking questions, friends. I don't propose to have all the answers. But I would suggest to you that weather is cyclical. For instance, in the 9th century, far before man-made CO2, the 9th century saw a great warming. But the 17th century saw a great cooling. The period from 1645 to 1715 is known as the Maunder Minimum, or the Little Ice Age. It was so cold during this Little Ice Age in the 16 and 1700s that the Thames River actually froze over. How often does not that happen? I'm not from England, but I would suspect it doesn't happen very often. So weather patterns tend to be cyclical. How could man-produced carbon dioxide have brought about the warming of the 9th century? It couldn't have. Point, the earth warms and cools cyclically. So that would raise the question, is man primarily responsible for the warming? A lot of climate alarmism has political and religious foundations. What do you mean? Well, political foundations. I was reading recently in the National Review, and the author made the point that without fail, the proposed solutions for climate change always seem to involve two things. One, higher taxes, and two, more government control. Is that coincidental? Is it incidental? Or is there something going on there? But more importantly, climate alarmism tends to have a religious foundation. In other words, climate change is a religious experience for many of its adherents, providing them with meaning, with purpose in life, making them feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. I mean, after all, if we're responsible to save the universe, then that would be a much greater cause than just our lives from day to day. But we see this downward spiral in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 25. When an unbeliever stops worshiping God, they start worshiping someone or something else, in this case, nature, the natural world. And when creation becomes more important than the Creator, Satan has people right where he wants them. Mankind's value gets debased, and so mankind then begins to exalt Mother Earth, Mother Nature, oceans, rivers, sharks, polar bears, trees, and so on. One of our family's favorite channels is BBC Earth. It's a wonderful channel in so many respects, amazing shows and expeditions. But it's a steady diet as well that we have to be on guard for and trying to teach our kids about. It's a steady diet of exalting creation over mankind. So one of our favorite shows there is Steve Backshall, his expeditions, and he'll go out into some pristine natural environment and he'll make comments along the lines as he's seeing amazing creatures. This is nature undisturbed. This is the way it's supposed to be, as if nature undisturbed is good and humanity's intrusion is bad. We are the bad guys. Humans are the bad guys. That's just part and parcel of the philosophy of this age. The satanic deception that somehow the natural world is better if humans aren't around. Evolutionists don't know that the problems of the world are caused by sin, so they'll always struggle to think properly about our world. And climate change paranoia is understandable for an evolutionist who thinks we're a product of chance and that we could just as easily be obliterated as easily as we appeared. So, friends, please understand, and I think you'll recognize this, whatever side of the debate you're on, the evidence is the same. The scientific data is the same. It's the interpretation of it. And how do you interpret the scientific data? Well, you interpret it through your worldview. And if your worldview is we're an accident here and we could just as easily be wiped out, then yes, you have reason to be terrified. But if your worldview says there is a loving creator God who has good purposes, then fear is driven out. Just practically speaking, could the emphasis in our day be shifted to a more influential resolution rather than spending trillions of dollars on trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and failing at that by and large. Are those trillions of dollars really making a difference in the third world countries for people who are starving? Some of you might say yes. I would gently push back and say I'm not convinced of that. Wouldn't those in poverty in the world be better served if we address needs such as jobs, food, safe drinking water in particular, clothing, shelter? And perhaps if we shifted our focus to reducing real pollution and dumping sewage into oceans, maybe that would make a greater difference in the long run. I'm making suggestions here. I'm not a scientist, but all of us have to wrestle through these questions. If climate alarmism is religious in nature, as I've suggested, then we would expect that the Bible would provide us with general principles in order to think properly about it. I think there are 6, and we'll quickly look at them. Number 1, we should responsibly use the natural resources that God has given us. Genesis 2:15, the Lord God took the man and put him in the garden to cultivate it and to keep it. We should responsibly use the natural resources that God has given us. Some of us believers should become scientists, and Dr. Ward makes a great case for that in the chapter that you'll read. Science is a critical way of loving your neighbor as yourself, of doing good to others by discovering ways to make our planet more useful to humanity. What are the 2 purposes for being a scientist? If you're a believer, your 2 major purposes are, 1, to get to know God better through the study of his natural world. And you see his fingerprints all over the place, his glory. And then number 2, to make it better for people around you, to not only love God more, but to love your neighbor as yourself, fulfilling the 2 greatest commands. My father-in-law, Carl Monroe, who's in heaven with the Lord now, he was a scientist. He was a chemist with Dow. And he made the world better through his patents and inventions, working a lot with silicones and rubbers. He made the world a better place for other people. Whatever your vocation is, not just if you're a scientist, whatever your vocation is, if you're a plumber, if you're a musician, if you're an architect, if you're a trashman, if you're a teacher, what is your purpose? You say, well, my purpose is to provide food for my family. And that's true. That is one of the biblical purposes. But that's part of the 2nd greatest command, loving your neighbor as yourself, providing for your family. Your 2 greatest purposes for your vocation, for your job, whatever it is number 1, to love God in whatever you do. And number 2, to love your neighbor as yourself, to benefit humanity in some way. And that's what gives work significance. We're not anti-science as believers, though we're often stereotyped that way. Think about it. Solomon, the wisest believer in the ancient world, about 1,000 years before Christ, he was a scientist of sorts. He studied nature, and that's described in 1 Kings 4:29. It says he spoke 3,000 proverbs. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that it's in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that grows on the wall. He spoke also of animals and birds and creeping things and fish. And so if you're a scientist and a believer today, you're following the footsteps of people like Solomon. But whether we're a scientist or not, we are responsible to use wisely the natural resources that God has given us. If you get accused of being a climate change denier, you probably also get accused of not caring about the natural world, and that's simply not true. I can recycle, probably to my wife's chagrin, I can recycle and compost with the best of them. We're not against responsibly using the natural resources that God has given us. In fact, that's what we're for. A really interesting passage in Deuteronomy chapter 20 that hit me when I was reading through my Bible reading plan here a few months ago. Never hit me in this sense. But Deuteronomy 20, verses 19 to 20, Moses is giving instructions to the children of Israel before they cross over the Jordan River into the promised land to claim the land that God was giving them. And he makes a very interesting statement here that has application to the way we use our natural resources. In Deuteronomy 20, verses 19 to 20, Moses commands the Israelites, when you besiege a city a long time, to make war against it in order to capture it. So you've got the city surrounded. He says, you shall not destroy its trees by swinging an axe against them, for you may eat from them, and you shall not cut them down. For is the tree of the field a man that it should be besieged by you? He says you're not against the fruit trees. You're not trying to capture them. Only the trees which you know are not fruit trees shall you destroy and cut down, that you may construct siege works against that city that's making war with you until it falls. So you need a battering ram. You need siege works. He says cut down the trees that aren't fruit trees. Say, what does this have to do with our responsibility to the natural world? Well, in this account, God is teaching the Israelites not to waste the natural resources he provided them. And notice, the reasoning is not the planet is more important than people are. That's not the reasoning at all. The reason that God gives here is you may eat from these fruit trees if you're not foolish enough to cut them down. If you don't waste them, then you can eat from them and they can benefit you. In other words, use the natural resources wisely, not because the natural resources are more important than you, the planet is more important than you, but because in Genesis 1, God made the world a place so that man could thrive on it. The natural resources are for man's benefit. We don't exist for the natural world. The natural world exists for our benefit. Careful study of Genesis 1 corroborates that. So is there a good word to capture our responsibility to the natural world? I think there is. I think it's the word stewardship. Stewardship implies supervising, so authority over, supervising, and caring for. Isn't that what God was telling Adam and Eve in Genesis 2:15? He says, I'm putting you in the Garden of Eden. This is before sin. Even before sin, I'm putting you in the garden to cultivate it, to work it, to use it for your benefit, to make it more productive, and to keep it. That's why stewardship. So we as believers have this responsibility. We're not promoting indiscriminate mining. We're not polluting the waters. We want to wisely steward the resources that God has given us. Second, we're to exercise dominion over nature. Genesis 1 is such a crucial passage for having the right understanding of our natural world. If you don't understand Genesis 1, you're not going to understand our responsibility. And this is probably why that so many professing believers don't understand how to care for the natural world, because they've adopted the evolutionary theory. They put a theistic spin on it. But when you put a theistic evolutionary spin on our natural world, then you're probably not going to be able to reach the right conclusions about our responsibility toward nature. In Genesis 1:28-30, we see the second principle is that we are to exercise dominion over nature. We are not subservient to nature. Humans are to exercise dominion over nature, and this is not lost after the fall. It's more difficult now for sure. It says, God blessed them, and God said to them, he's speaking to Adam and Eve, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. That speaks to the Darwinian evolutionary perspective on overpopulation. He says, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that's on the surface of all the earth, every tree which has fruit yielding seed. It shall be food for you, and to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the sky, to everything that moves on the earth which has life. I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. As Dr. Ward points out in Biblical Worldview, human beings have the right and the responsibility to rearrange nature in order to meet human needs. That is biblical, I believe. Nature exists for humans, not the other way around. We are commanded, in fact, to kill animals for food. It's commended by the Creator there in Genesis 9. I won't read all of that, but Genesis 9, 1-4. Now, certainly killing animals purely for sport is a perversion. Proverbs 12:10. A righteous man has the regard for the life of his animal, but even the compassion of the wicked is cruel. So you don't just kill for sport. You kill to meet human needs, whether it be for eating or for products that are beneficial to humanity, oils and things, for clothing, for furs, responsible, wisely. But animals were put on the earth in part for our benefit as human beings. And anything else is not a biblical perspective. So we're to exercise dominion over nature, wise stewardship, using it for our benefit. Number 3, we should worship the Creator, not His creation. That's spelled out in Romans 1, another hugely important text for Christian apologetics. Number 4, we should reserve our highest care for the only part of creation made in God's image. What's the only part of creation that's specifically identified in biblical teaching as being made in the image of God? It's not rocks, it's not plants, it's not animals, it's not even the angels. It's human beings. That's what God tells us in Genesis 1:26. 27, He made us in His image. We reflect. We're not gods. We will never become gods. But we reflect the glory of God. He made us to image Him. Dr. Ward includes a really interesting quote by Prince Philip. In one of these chapters on science, Dr. Ward includes this quote. Prince Philip revealed how low a view of humans he had when he said, "In the event that I am reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus." You say, why? That's curious. He explains, in order to contribute something to solve overpopulation. Now, certainly we've got to be wise about spacing and the availability of natural resources. But reality is there's still a lot of space in our world. Have you been to Kansas? Have you been to Saskatchewan? There are a lot of places where you still have some elbow room. See, this is from an evolutionary viewpoint. Nature is good. Humans are lesser or even bad. Something's got to give. All right, humans. But friends, when a species of animal goes extinct, we're not happy about that as believers. That's sad. But when just one human being is killed, when one baby is murdered in its mother's belly by the consent of the mom, as a doctor there kills that baby, that's a tragedy. When an older person dies, society says they're not worth much. God says they're worth a lot because they're made in my image. When one human being is killed, it's a tragedy. Why? Because we're made in the image of God. Didn't Jesus teach in Matthew 10 and Luke 12 that humans are more valuable than animals? So we as believers should care not ultimately the most for the planet. We want to be wise stewards. We should care the most for the highest of God's creation, the souls of men and women and boys and girls around us. Isn't God more concerned about the 2 greatest commands? And I know some people would say, well, caring for our planet is part of the 2 greatest commands, but I think that's missing something. Loving your neighbor as yourself. Yes, I don't want policies that are detrimental to them putting food on their table. Most of all, I want them to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so we go into all the world to preach the gospel to every creature in Matthew 16:15, because they're made in the image of God. Have you thought through the fact that nations that were founded on Judeo-Christian principles tend not to have as much poverty as nations that weren't? You say, what are you driving at here, Pastor Michael? Well, giving the gospel, in my estimation, will make more difference for the poor than seeking to reduce your carbon footprint ever will. I mean, you can try and offset your carbon footprint on United and Delta and you're flying, and that's not going to benefit the poor of the world in the same way that getting the gospel to them will. Number 5, we must understand that the world will survive till true global warming comes. When is that? The day of the Lord. Second coming, 2 Peter 3, says the elements of this world will be destroyed with an intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not promoting this idea that the world's going to be burned up and remade someday, so who cares about it? That's not what I'm teaching at all. I'm teaching a level of priorities. Human beings here, nature down here. Nature existing for the benefit of human beings. That's gotten flipped in our day. And I'm trying to help get it back this way, in a way that reflects the biblical teaching. And number 6, we must recognize the world will continue to experience variations in temperatures and seasons. How do you know that? God guarantees it in the Bible. Genesis 8, 21 to 22. A very vital passage for you as a believer to become familiar with if you're going to have a renewed mind, a proper biblical perspective on all the climate change alarmism that you experience day in and day out. Here, after the flood, Noah comes out of the ark, and God makes this amazing promise. In Genesis 8, verse 22, he says, while the earth remains, in other words, as long as it exists, seed time, planting, and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, shall not cease. Now, he's not promising it might not be a little cooler, it might not be a little hotter, it might not be much hotter or much cooler. World might go back into a little ice age. We simply don't know. But God promises that as long as this universe exists, there's going to be variations in seasons and temperatures. And I like that. I feel bad for people that don't have variations of seasons. And our seasons here in Alberta don't have as much variety as they did where I grew up in South Carolina or where my wife grew up in Michigan. But I really feel bad for people that live at the beach where they don't get those variations in season. And you say, Pastor Michael, now I know you're crazy. This just confirms it. Well, different strokes to different folks, whatever you prefer. But God says cold and heat, seed time and harvest, they'll continue on. That's a really settling promise from our great God, from somebody who can do something about it. So let's think about your friends and family members, your coworkers, your students that are walking around at high school and university here at Mount Royal and SAIT and University of Calgary. They're scared about climate change. In 2021, a survey of 10,000 young people from 10 countries around the world disclosed that most are living in great fear because of climate change. BBC reports on this study. They say nearly 60% of young people said they felt very worried or extremely worried. 3/4 of them said they thought the future was frightening. Over half, 56% of them, get this, over 56% of young people say they think humanity is doomed. Why? Because of climate change. And they're mad about the government for not doing enough to protect their future children and for taking care of animals. They think governments have been slow to respond and are tone deaf. 2/3 of young people reported feeling sad, afraid, and anxious. One 16-year-old said it's different for young people. The destruction of the planet for us is personal. It's a doomsday scenario. It's a worst case scenario. And they think it's going to be changed by human beings. They're so scared that 4 out of 10 of them are hesitant to even have kids. They don't want to bring kids into this world. And that makes sense if what they believe is true. Then why would you want to bring kids into the world to be destroyed? The future is very frightening to them. Can I point out that Satan doesn't care whom or what you fear as long as it's not the Lord Jesus Christ. He doesn't care what your idol is. He doesn't care what your greatest fear is, as long as it's not Jesus Christ. So then what is the answer to climate change alarmism? How can you use this material to defend the Christian faith? Well, it's not to talk down to climate change alarmists. It's not to make fun of them, to disparage them, to call them names, to ridicule them. I've tried to model for you in this presentation how to interact and dialogue with them. Very gracious. Because if you truly believe this, if you didn't know the Lord and you believe this, then you would be scared out of your mind too, most likely. The fear is not well placed, but it is real. They're genuinely feeling fear. They're afraid. They're anxious. And what's the answer to fear? Who's the answer to fear? Who should they fear? They should fear the one who's able to destroy both their soul and body in hell, Jesus says. But Satan's got them fearing climate change. And when they're thinking about climate change, they're not thinking about fearing God. We need to help them to think about the right kind of fear. So let's take the gospel to these fear-filled human beings, because they're made in God's image. Let's get them the gospel. Let's point them to this rock. Let's tell them, you need to fear God. You don't need to fear the future. Come know this true God who's driven fear out of my heart. Explain to them why we have hope. Isn't that what 1 Peter 3:15 says? Give them an answer for the hope. Why are you not going to pieces over the future? Why are you still having kids? Why do you want big families? Whatever that is in God's plan for you. It's because we have Jesus, right? He's the answer. Fearing him is the answer to climate change fear. We're going to shift over to Zoom for a quick discussion with anyone who's interested in going deeper. Thanks for your time tonight.